The end of chapter 6 brings us to the point of that first line of chapter 2, where Edward was leaving Waverley Honour. This chapter is all about everybody saying goodbye to him. It's early afternoon and it's starting to get warm, but I think I've got another half hour or so of recording outside. So chapter 6 is all about saying goodbye. His father isn't there, his father is still in London. It seems to me that after his mum died when Edward was 11 or 12, he hardly ever sees his father. The father spends more and more time in London doing his politics stuff. At the beginning of chapter 6, Edward is in the library, which seems to be his place. That's where he always is. And he's taken down the old broadsword that hangs over the chimney, and that broadsword belonged to Sir Hildebrand, who was an ancestor active in the war. He was a Cavalier. They were the two sides, were Cavalier and Roundhead, and Roundheads were in support of the government. Like I think I mentioned in my video that Charles I, they ousted him and set up a sort of council of state to take over. So the Roundheads were on the side of the parliamentarians, the council of state, and the Cavaliers were on the side of Charles I. The Waverleys were Cavaliers, so they fought for Charles I. So there's this big portrait of Sir Hildebrand over the library, just over the sword that belonged to him. So I've got the big portrait and he's there with like masses of long curly hair, because that was the signature thing in those days. The Roundheads had this really short hair, kind of like a fruit bowl hair, you know, like put the bowl over your head and cut it. They had very short hair, and the Cavaliers had really, they never cut their hair, really long, really luxurious hair. So Everard comes into the library to say goodbye to Edward, and the whole thing takes place under this giant portrait of Sir Hildebrand, which is a nice bit of imagery, I think. Since it's all about war, Sir Hildebrand was a soldier who fought for the Cavaliers, which was for the establishment, for the king, for the rightful king. And now here is Edward going off into the military on what Everard feels is the wrong side, but he still thinks it's better to go off and fight, even if it's on the wrong side, than to just stay at home idly dreaming and doing absolutely nothing. And there's no war going on, even though there has been, and there's a lot of feeling, and people aren't really comfortable with the way things settled. There's no actual war, so although he's going into the military, he's not heading off to battle. The idea is, what they're all thinking is, he's just going to go in to meet his regiment. He'll spend a year or two doing manoeuvres and playing games and being social. Basically, he's just got himself a military rank of captain without any of the danger. That's what they're all thinking. There hadn't really been any battle since 1715, since the Jacobite uprising of 1715, which went so badly that although the ministry does think there's a lot of dissent out there still, it's barely even tension anymore. It's kind of just regrets and nostalgia more than anything else. So Everard comes into the library and he plans some massive speech, but he drops it because that's just not his style. So then he says, "Remember the name you bear if you end up in a battle. I have made such arrangements as will enable you to take the field as a Waverley. But remember that you are the last of the line, and the only hope of its revival depends upon you. So don't die. Stay out of danger as much as you can. Don't go drinking and gambling. Don't get involved in duels. Don't live in any kind of risky way. If it's required in the line of duty, then you can't help it, but don't be reckless." And as he phrases it, "Keep no company with rakes, gamblers and Whigs." Whigs being Hanoverian supporters like his father. "Of whom it is to be feared there are but too many in the service into which you are going. However, your colonel is an excellent man, for a Presbyterian. The Presbyterians were Scottish. That was like the form of Christianity that they mainly had in Scotland, which English people were all a little bit sus of. Everard goes on, you will remember your duty to God, the Church of England, and the... He paused. This breach ought to have been supplied, according to the rubric, with the word king. But, as unfortunately that word conveyed a double and embarrassing sense, one meaning de facto and the other de jure, the knight filled up the blank otherwise. The Church of England and all constituted authorities. By which he means de facto, meaning he doesn't believe that the current king is the real king, George I, because, you know, all the reasons that we talked about in that last video. So he is de facto. He is just in the place of the king because he shouldn't really be there. And de jure, meaning absent, the absent king, being the old pretender. That was all he said, but he took his nephew to the stables to see the horses destined for his campaign, because Sir Everard is anachronistic in the way he thinks, and his idea of going off to join your regiment is you take in supplies. That was what the kings of old did. They used to take soldiers. It wasn't just them. They would bring soldiers from their property, like their farmers' sons and anyone they could raise from their property among their employers. They would get them together, and the son of the house would go off, and he'd be bringing his own little troop, his own troop to join. So it wasn't just him, it was his troop. And Everard still sees this as the proper way to do it, but he's been told that they don't do it like that anymore. So he's just given him a couple of people to go with him. 2 black chargers and 3 stout active hacks. Two domestics are to attend him from the hall. Everard says, if you need a third one, get a groom when you get to Scotland. So Everard isn't entirely comfortable with such a small retinue, but he says, you will depart with but a small retinue compared to Sir Hildebrand, when he mustered before the gates of the hall a larger body of horse than your whole regiment consists of. I could have wished that these 20 young fellows from my estate who have enlisted in your troop had been to march on your journey to Scotland. So he's actually roused up 20 men from the estate, 20 youngsters, who have enlisted, but they've enlisted as common soldiers. So they're not travelling with Edward, they're going on their own, but Everard still feels this is his duty done. This is the contribution that Waverley Honour, the place, had to make. And then he gives Edward a letter to take to a friend of his who lives in Scotland. Carefully folded, surrounded by a little stripe of flock silk according to ancient form, and sealed with an accurate impression of the Waverley coat of arms. It was addressed with great formality to Cosmo Comine Bradwardine, Esquire, of Bradwardine, at his principal mansion of Tully Veolan in Perthshire. Then we get the whole story of this man. This guy was very active in the 1715 uprising, escaped but was caught. And when he was caught, he showed that he understood the classics. This came to the attention of, I may not have mentioned this, you know, all the things I did mention, the 1 or 2 things that I missed, come back here. Everard had a lawyer. And right at the start he called the lawyer in because he was going to change his will to get rid of Richard. And there was a bit of stuff about the lawyer and his background that I didn't bother talking about. And now it's relevant, of course. So his lawyer had been part of the Jacobite uprising, but wasn't caught. Everard got his lawyer to defend a whole lot of people who were caught in that uprising, a whole lot of soldiers who couldn't afford to defend themselves. But Everard felt that they'd served their country faithfully, they'd served their true king faithfully, and they ought to be defended. So he sent his lawyer off, his solicitor lawyer, it's all a bit muddled in these days, off to defend them and get them back home. Now this fella, Bradwardine, is one of the people that the lawyer defended. After Bradwardine was released, I don't quite know how that happened. Anyway, he was released. He came and stayed at Waverley Honour for several weeks, and he and Everard hit it off, and they've been firm friends ever since. So Bradwardine is a Scottish person and lives in Scotland. There was a bond to be paid for his freedom, and Everard paid it for him. But when he went home, he got together the money and he sent it, because a Scotsman always pays his debt. And it actually was a real hardship to him to do it, because he wasn't very rich, but he didn't say anything about that. He just paid the money and got his steward to send the money to Everard, to whom it actually just wasn't much money at all. And Everard never realised what it cost this fellow to do it. But every year after that, they exchange hampers. So the Scottish guy sends a hamper full of like fresh caught fish and produce and stuff from Scotland, which is pretty much better than anything that Everard had in England. And Everard sends him fine brandy and things that you get in England that you don't get in Scotland. So it's been this great friendship that's lasted for years and years and years. And now Everard has given Edward a letter saying, when you get there, can you deliver this to this man? And then we go on and talk about his tutor, who is also going to be missing very much. And his tutor, it turns out, has written a couple of books that he tried to get published. They're highly Jacobite. He tried to get them published at a Jacobite supporting publishing company in London, but they're actually not very good. So the publishing company said, well, he wouldn't get the return on it. If he published that many pages, so many words, it'd never pay. This tutor tried a few times. It's taken him most of his life to write these. They're his magnum opus. Is it opus? Opuses? The tutor, because he doesn't know what to do with them really, he thinks some good will come of them if Edward reads them. So he gives them to Edward to take with him to read when he's got nothing better to do, because they're all very instructive and full of moral fibre and stuff. Edward's a little bit taken aback by this and just pops them in the corner of his trunk. But he's kind about it, because he knows that it took the tutor a long time to write it. Then we have Aunt Rachel. She says goodbye. Her farewell was brief and affectionate. She only cautioned her dear Edward, whom she probably deemed somewhat susceptible, against the fascination of Scottish beauty. She allowed that the northern part of the island contained some ancient families, but they were all Whigs and Presbyterians except the Highlanders, and respecting them, she must needs say there could be no great delicacy among the ladies, where the gentleman's usual attire was, as she had been assured, to say the least, very singular and not at all decorous, because they wear kilts and you can see their legs and no underwear, and this is all very shocking to a well brought up English lady. So this is sort of telling us how the English people were seeing the Scottish people, which is kind of the impression that Walter Scott wanted to correct. They're heathens, they're ignorant, and they're Presbyterian, which is not true Christianity. It's all very black in that front. So Aunt Rachel concluded her farewell with a kind and moving benediction, and gave the young officer, as a pledge of her regard, a valuable diamond ring, often worn by the male sex at that time, and a purse of broad gold pieces, which also were more common 60 years since than they have been of late. That is the end of the chapter, and now Edward is ready to depart. And yeah, this book is moving quite slowly. I do agree that a lot of this could have been reduced, but then I'm looking at it from a modern perspective. In these days, they wanted a book to be long. There's no TV, there's very few neighbours. There's nothing wrong with having a long book that moves slowly. Just sort of sitting there chatting idly with the author, as it were, as you move through. So that's the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 was really short. After all this time spent at Waverley Honour, which I actually think it was good to see that. I like to get to know somebody in their daily, everyday place before a story takes off. So it's nice to see just what he was doing and how they were all spending their time. But having gone that slowly, he just kind of skips stuff. So what happens in this one, in the space of 2.5 pages, he leaves home goes to London, has a short visit with his dad, and then rides to Scotland. We're told that. That just doesn't happen on the screen, as it were, and I'm feeling the lack. It does say that he was a bit anxious. All the old domestics and inhabitants of the village saw him off. Everard had convinced like 20 or so youngsters to go and sign up and be in his regiment, and their parents are there to see him off. Some of them apparently make sly petitions for sergeantries and corporalships for their youngsters, because they say, well, they'd never have gone to be a soldier if it wasn't for you going. They're going to look after you, so see what you can do and see if you can move them up in the ranks, because for common soldiers the first promotion is to a corporal, and then you become a sergeant. So that's the first couple of ranks. In these days you entered the military either as a common soldier or as an officer, and you had to pay for the officer ranks. Richard's employers, the ministers in London, have actually paid for him to have this. And I should mention that he's a dragoon. He's moved into a fairly prestigious regiment. There are different types of regiments, and dragoons are definitely classier than, for instance, a regiment of foot. The dragoons were often actually attached to royalty of some sort, or to dukes or whatever. I haven't really made a study of that, but that's kind of how it was. So he's moved into a reasonably prestigious regiment at the rank of captain, which is pretty well that he's set. Some people never reach captain, but the other people from the estate, who are just the peasantry, they've gone in as common soldiers, and they really are stuck at the base level. So they've got the absolute drudge work to do, and they're the primary cannon fodder unless they can move up into the ranks of corporal and beyond that to sergeant. So that's what the families are saying to him when they say, you know, sorry to see you go. See if you can get them shifted up, because, well, they're safer, the money's better, and they've signed up for the military, which means they're kind of stuck there. In those days there was no leaving unless the regiment disbanded or the troop disbanded, or I think you could buy your way out, because money made things a lot easier in these days. But if you couldn't do any of that, there was no end to your term of service. You were just there forever. You were a soldier for life, or until you died, or until you got pensioned off. After a short visit to London, he proceeded on horseback, then the general mode of travelling, to Edinburgh, and from thence to Dundee, a seaport on the eastern coast of Ayrshire, where his regiment was then quartered. So just a couple of sentences. Here he is already in Dundee. He loved it at first because he liked new things. It was all unique, it was all fascinating. There's a lot of novelty to it, and he's very good at that sort of thing. He's very capable and competent, and while he's interested, he can do a lot. So at first it all went really well, and they loved him and everything he tried. He sort of worked at it and started to master it. Colonel Gardner is the boss of the regiment. Colonel Gardner was a bit older but a very well presented man, and everything that a young soldier might want to look up to. He's quite a dashing figure, his manners are impeccable, he's really well bred. It says, in his early years he had been what is called, by manner of palliative, a very gay young man. That's gay in its original sense of like a very happy, cheerful, active young man. And strange stories were circulated about his sudden conversion from doubt, if not infidelity, to a serious and even enthusiastic turn of mind. So something happened to him. He was going off the rails, I gather. He was the party kid, the playboy of the regiment, and then all of a sudden one day he's just had a change of heart and become really serious, and nobody knows why, and he has never told them. And that makes him an even more interesting character to all of the people under him, all of his men. Waverley has some training. Already a good horseman, he was now initiated into the arts of the manege, different types of horsemanship. He gets some training in field duty. The duty of an officer is in its essence a very dry and abstract task. depending chiefly upon arithmetical combinations requiring much attention and a cool and reasoning head to bring them into action. So there's a lot of pomp attached to this role, but behind it all there's a lot of tedious stuff, and that's bringing him undone now. He doesn't like that. Our hero was liable to fits of absence, in which his blunders excited some mirth and called down some reproof. He's embarrassed by this. He asked himself in vain why his eye could not judge of distance or space so well as those of his companions, why his head was not always successful to execute a particular evolution, and why his memory, so alert upon most occasions, did not correctly retain technical phrases and minute points of etiquette or field discipline. The novel is wearing off. He's still good at some things, but it's taking him a while to learn, and because of the way he was raised, because he basically just followed what he was interested in and gave up on what he wasn't, this is a new thing for him to learn. He's never had to apply himself before like this. He's also rather lonely. The gentry of the neighbourhood were disaffected, meaning they really didn't give a stuff about the military. I mean, the military people, they're not permanent, you know. They come in and then they go, and that must have happened over and over and over with the people of the town. They're not interested in making friends with them. And so he's there until summer, and I'm not actually sure when he got there, but anyway, it is now summer. He's been there for a few months. He's got this letter still to pass on to Bradwardine, Sir Everard's friend. So he's decided he's going to apply for a leave of absence and take that letter. He gets his leave and he heads off. He travelled, of course, on horseback and with a single attendant, and passed his first night at a miserable inn where the landlady had neither shoes nor stockings, and the landlord, who called himself a gentleman, was disposed to be rude to his guest because he had not bespoke the pleasure of his society to supper. The next day, traversing an open and unenclosed country, Edward gradually approached the highlands of Perthshire. So that's it. That's chapter 7. Very small. The thing about this one is that Scott was just really keen to get on with the story. Or maybe he had a whole lot there that he was able to take out after people complained about how long it took him to get going. That would have been interesting though, I think, because this is Edward's first visit to Scotland, and us, the viewer, it would have been nice to actually get to see that, to see what he thought of the countryside, whether he found it different, what he thought of the weather. Just basically, did it seem to him like it was just a different bit of England, or was it a very alien place? Was he having trouble with the Scottish accent even in Dundee? And it would also have been interesting to know what was the makeup of the regiment. Were they, say, mostly Scottish people in it? Were they British? Were they all British? How did they handle his coming in like that as captain? Which, even for an officer, that's jumping ranks a little bit. Did they seem to have any advance notice of who he was? Had they been told to look out for him? This is probably going to come up, but I feel like that was the bit to do it. When he first got to that camp in Dundee, that was the time. So that now when he's going on to visit his Uncle Everard's friend, it would have been nice to know a little bit about that first few months. And it was good to have the details we did have. But I don't even know, was it a few months? Was it like 2 weeks? Could he have been there for only 2 weeks and then gotten leave to go off tripping into the Highlands, which, while it's sort of close, it's not a day trip. 2 or 3 days travel there, a couple of days staying there and a couple back. So how can he do that? How can he just go off to his regiment and then just take leave like that when he hasn't even grasped all the things he needs to know? He hasn't completed his training. These are the questions I have, and some of these are probably because of the distance between now and then. Maybe everybody who was going to read this when it was first out kind of knew how the military worked, and that wouldn't have surprised them maybe. But it does surprise me. I do like, though, the introduction to a Scottish person, like the couple at the inn, how he was surprised by the innkeeper's wife having no stockings or shoes, and how rude the innkeeper was. Because in England, of course, the innkeepers are very subservient. They're very full of flattery and a high level of service, and it's not like you've entered their private house. It's like you're paying for their time and their attention, and they give that, whereas obviously this was quite a change for him here in Scotland. Not that he's had much experience of English inns either, presumably. When he went to London with his dad, like maybe they stayed at an inn on the way. Yeah, there's a few things I don't know. I feel like this is the first chapter that I have felt I wish there was more in it. But at least we're starting the action. So we'll see what the next one brings.